Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I want to wish you a warm welcome to our weekly webinar, which is True Africa University and MIT Center for International Studies in collaboration with MIT Africa. We've been really talking about these sustainable development issues for Africa since March of 2021. So we've been at it for more than a year. And each week, in this season, and it usually lasts, between 7 and 12 weeks, we talk about specific issues related to the future of Africa and a more virtuous circle of development for Africa than we are used to. And the topic today was going to be about leadership, a very important issue for Africa, because I'm one of those people who have been arguing for a long time that the situation that the African continent is in today is because of what I'll just call bluntly failed leadership on a political level, on an economic level, lack of solidarity, lack of reinvestment, a lot of issues that are endemic and that have basically been preventing the continent from moving forward in fulfilling its full potential. We were supposed to have a discussion with Obi Ezekwesili, who is the former Minister of Education in Africa and one of the leaders of the Bring Back Our Girls movement in Nigeria. And unfortunately, Obi had to travel today. There was a scheduling issue and she was actually on a plane today and she was not able to actually participate. But luckily, a few days ago, I reached out to Peris Bosire, who I met in Accra, in Ghana, 5 years ago, because she was presenting as one of the finalists for the Innovation Prize for Africa. So I met her in Accra at this hotel, and I started talking to her. And I remember that I was really, really struck by the intelligence of her approach to entrepreneurship, to sustainable farming, to redistribution, to what I've been calling active solidarity. And so I've been following Peris ever since. And she's now an MBA candidate at the MIT Sloan School, where basically the School of Management, where I was actually a Sloan Fellow more than a decade ago. And Peris is there, but she's also basically proven herself already as an entrepreneur, as a self-made entrepreneur. And I've been going to Nairobi a lot, where Peris is from, for the past decade. And what I've noticed in Nairobi, which is really interesting, is this new wave of entrepreneurship in Nairobi. And what's interesting is everybody always calls Nairobi the tech capital of Africa because there's so many tech startups. One thing I noticed was that many of those startups were founded by white Americans or white Europeans who basically were camping out in Nairobi trying to solve Africans' problems. And one of the reasons, I encourage that, and I have several friends who've done just that, but I was also very drawn to Peris's approach with FarmDrive and with her other projects, which is very much about homegrown solutions to actual African problems. As a woman, she's really, truly fearless. She's been proven herself in the space, in the tech space for a while. And it was a real pleasure to welcome her to our weekly webinar to talk about leadership in Africa, because I guess where I'm going with all this is Peris is the kind of future leader that Africa needs. I saw that the very first day I met her 5 years ago, and I wanted her to speak about her own journey with FarmDrive and also talk about some of the young leaders who inspire her across the continent. And so with no further ado, I want to welcome and share my pride and honor in speaking with Peris Bosire today. Thank you, Peris, for joining us.
Thank you, Claude, and thank you for the very kind introduction. I can't imagine it's been 5 years since we last met in Accra. I'll start by way of introducing myself and just giving more context to why agriculture is very passionate to me and why leadership. So as Claude mentioned, my name is Peris Nyaboe Bosire. In the US now, by way of Kenya. I was raised in Southwest Kenya in a small village, an area called Kisii. It's the highlands of Lake Victoria, lots of rain. So as you can tell, you know how that goes with agriculture and where my passion comes from. I moved to the US in August 2021, last year, to start my MBA at MIT Sloan School of Management. And one of my key goals is to actually continue advancing my leadership skills and growing as a leader to transform Africa. Before coming to Sloan, I had spent about 6 years working on a company that I started with my co-founder when we left college from our undergrad in computer science. And the name of my company is called FarmDrive. The main work that we do, or our vision, is to drive more capital to the agriculture sector in Africa. We are very passionate, and we chose agriculture particularly because we understand from how we grew up, the villages where we came from, how agriculture is very transformational in changing the livelihoods of many people and creating income, not just for the families that live in the rural areas, but also transforming the food systems in the global markets. I'll go on and speak more about my journey and how I met Rita, who's my business partner, how we grew FarmDrive. Michelle, can you go to the next slide? But I want to start with explaining this slide, which I project in most of my presentations, and what it means to me and why the work that I do is very important, not just now, not just from the 6 years we've been doing this work, but in the future. This is my friend Isaiah, who's smiling at you in the screen. And when you look at him, you see, a very happy man, smiling, holding his bag of goods. And I think this is French beans in that bag. But if you zoom in, you'll see more people at the farm. It's not just Isaiah on this farm. Isaiah was one of our very first clients 4 years ago, or I think 5 years ago, at the same time I met Claude at FarmDrive. And for me, the vision of Africa and the vision of agriculture, and when I think about smallholder farmers, I see business people, I see investments, I see capital efficient businesses or small businesses that need financing to thrive. But the image that comes to mind when we talk about agriculture or smallholder farming in Africa for most people is poverty, it's destitution, it's unemployment. It's what you do when you don't have something else to do or when you don't have a job. But as you can see in this image, that's not the case. Isaiah has about, when we went on his farm on that day, he had about 7 people working for him at the farm. And for me, that's the image that drove me to start thinking broadly about my work and my involvement in agriculture. So my journey started about 30 years ago. So in a way, I've revealed my age. I was born in Nairobi, but my parents, my mom moved to Kisii, where she got her job. And in that upbringing as a firstborn, I was in a village setting. My mom was farming and at the same time teaching at a school. One of the things that I noticed from the early age is, much as she was teaching salaries, most teachers, and I think this is a global problem, they're not paid very well. They don't make a lot of money from their teaching practice. And that's one of the other areas when we go on to talk about leadership that we need to look at how we are compensating the most effective sectors in the continent. My mom was teaching, but at the same time, she was farming. But she could only get a loan from a bank because she was a teacher, because she had a payslip. She could not get a loan because she was farming. However, what I noticed is my mom was making a lot more money from her farming activities, and that's what she used to pay our school fees. My school fees and my siblings' school fees was paid mostly from the farm proceeds. So she'd take a loan because she could qualify for it because of her teaching practice and her salary. She'd put the money into agriculture, make way more money, supply food to the schools around my area, supply food to the school that I went to, and that's how my school fees was paid. And it was years later when I was in college in my computer science class and thinking about problem solving and applying technology, mobile phones, that I realized there's a disconnect. All my life, I my mom has taken me through school. My mom's income has mostly come from agriculture, but she's not able to get a loan. Banks don't recognize her farming activity as her main source of income, but they recognize her teaching career, which doesn't give her a lot of money. And in my head, I started thinking about the other families whose parents don't have the opportunity to have double incomes, whose parents are not teachers, which was 90% of the people in my village where I grew up. 90% of the people were employed in agriculture and working in some part of the value chain, either in production, in getting things to the market, or supplying, being tractor providers and input sellers. In some way, everyone had a role to play in the agriculture value chain, about 90%. Only 10% had an opportunity to work in civil service, which meant that in my village, less than 10% of the people were considered by banks as viable customers. To this date, I keep saying, and I think credit or being able to access capital is a human right. It's one of the basic things to get people to thrive and to prosper. So when I was in college and I met Rita, whose bio is exactly as mine, when you replace my name in our resumes or you replace her name with mine in her resume, you almost get the same person. Both studied computer science, both our moms were teachers and also farmers. Farming income paid most of our school fees. We started sharing these challenges and this disconnect, and that's when it hit us that the financial system and banking, how it works, it's really broken. It's not serving 54% of the population in Africa who are employed in agriculture, both directly in agriculture production as smallholder farmers who are producing or along part of the value chain. And that's how we started FarmDrive in 2015 to address the problem of financing to smallholder farmers and being able to shift the mindset of smallholder farming in agriculture from this career you go to when you don't have anything to do, but small businesses that are viable for investments. Michelle, we can move on to the next slide. So what's our big bet for Africa when it comes to agriculture? We believe that agriculture is the backbone of the economy in most African countries, and that has been shown in most statistics. A lot of countries make 25 to 30% of their GDP from agriculture. But at the same time, the statistics are very worrying. Less than 3% of commercial funding from most African countries actually goes to the agriculture sector. And when you draw that in a graph and start looking at those numbers, it should worry you. Any continent that's not investing in its food systems, it's a poor country, it's a poor continent, and it's an insecure continent. And that's what breeds things like the healthcare, that's what leads to war. It's all connected to the food ecosystems. How are we addressing this problem through FarmDrive? We are using data. Michelle, you can move on to the next slide. The next slide, please. So FarmDrive is using data-driven technology to bank on agriculture. And our big idea is banks have the money. The money is seated in bank deposits, but it's not reaching where it's needed most. Our main idea is to use technology to drive money and to drive finances where they're needed most. We are doing this by building software and backend infrastructure that different financial service providers can use to drive capital where it's needed most. When I talk about technology infrastructure, what we realized in our conversations with banks is it's not that they don't know that farmers exist. It's not that they don't know that farmers need financing, but the main problem is how do you fix the information gap between what banks understand about farmers and what happens on the ground. Farming is very risky. There's real weather issues that affect farming. One season you'd have a farmer who's producing tons of maize or whatever crop they invested in, and the next season, because of unpredictability, you'll have the same farmer with almost 100% losses. So what we do as FarmDrive is we use different data sets and use different both machine learning algorithms and advanced statistical algorithms to create risk management software and create dashboards or web services that banks can use to understand what loan products are required by smallholder farmers and what's the best way to mitigate the risks that farmers face. Through the information of the data warehouse that we've built, we are helping different financial institutions intervene all the way from providing the right credit facilities to the farmers, loan products that are designed for different farming activities, to connecting market players to give these farmers the ability to sell what they're producing from their farms, and at the same time, connecting these farmers to insurance players or underwriters to be able to mitigate and prevent them from risks that they can't control, like weather-related risks. Our data warehouse consists of data that comes from different sources, both data that we've collected and digitized from 1 million smallholder farmers in Kenya, to big data. And when I talk about big data, we're talking about satellite imagery with sophisticated work that has been done by big organizations, our partnerships with organizations like the European Space Agency and Planet. We've been able to zero down to 1 meter by 1 meter of being able to understand these farms and predict what's going to happen on the ground, and use that data to predict crops and predict yields. And this information goes on to streamline and help us coordinate very well with the market and coordinate with the financing players. Our big bet for agriculture is by filling in the information gap, by structuring the right products, by providing solutions that mitigate both the real risks and the imagined risks in agriculture. We can get more money flowing. We can push the needle from 3% of commercial funding going to the agriculture sector to 10%, pushing that to 3%, at least to match the GDP that we're getting from agriculture. One of the things that we saw with COVID-19 is an increased risk in terms of food in most African countries. And that's it's a real crisis that we're dealing with right now. Food insecurity is rising. The input prices are rising in the continent. And as you've most recently seen with the war that's going on in Europe, I have to mention that Ukraine and Russia, it's affected what we import and what we export, and that has led to an increased insecurity. And that's a threat to most countries. And as I mentioned earlier, food insecurity is very connected to war. It's very connected to our healthcare systems. It's very connected to our education systems. So if we don't think about agriculture and financing and putting money in this sector, then it creates a ripple effect and affects very many of our other areas where we should invest for prosperity. Michelle, we can move on to the next slide. I want to talk about some of the success of what we've achieved in the last 5 years through putting in a lot of thought into this work, and what we think we can achieve in the next year, in another 5 years, with collaboration and resources and some of the leadership skills that we are getting from the schools. So for me, when I think about what success looks like for FarmDrive, and that's connected to the mission and why we started FarmDrive, which is how can we drive a lot of this money that's sitting in banks to different smallholder farmers. We don't want to become a bank. We don't want to compete, which is a conversation that I had to constantly have early on with the banks when I went to pitch our product. We're not here to compete. We are here to collaborate with you. You have money. Bank XYZ has money. We want to put all this money into the right use and drive it to people that need it the most. So how we measure our success for us is how many people or how many smallholder farmers and businesses that are working in agriculture have become active users of financial services. Kenya is a very peculiar market, I have to mention, because, and as Claude mentioned, there are very many, especially the technology sector in Kenya. It's thriving right now, and there are very many things that have made Kenya one of the top leaders in technology and innovation in the continent. But one of the things that stands out for me in Kenya is the use of mobile money. A lot of people, the mobile penetration rate in Kenya is very high, and a lot of people have adopted the use of mobile money and mobile phones. What that has led to is it has helped FarmDrive to be able to reach smallholder farmers that banks were not able to look at before. Through mobile phones and through their transactions on mobile money, we are able to identify where these smallholder farmers are. We're able to triangulate where these farmers are and use location sensitive algorithms to design very specific loan products from village to village, from county to county, from one crop, from one value chain to another value chain, from one macroclimate to another. Over the last 5 years that we've done this work with different partners, we've been able to make visible and digitize over 1 million, close to 1.2 million smallholder farmers who are in our database. And when you start thinking about what this does to an African continent, digitizing and knowing the economic activities your people are doing, it not only opens room for conversations on policies and regulations and the right kind of infrastructure that needs to be set, but it also starts opening up conversations around tax and taxation, because that's how our economies are built. We have to pay our tax. When we start digitizing small businesses that are viable, that are thriving, then we're also contributing to the economy through increasing the tax bracket of the people that are able to pay tax. We've worked with our partners to disburse $40 million and manage $40 million in portfolio to different smallholder farmers in Kenya. We've connected to 3 financial providers, and one of them is one of the largest telecommunication companies in Kenya that's working with us to build a new bank for smallholder farmers. And we are doing this with a goal to keep the portfolio or keep the risk for banks at a lower rate than the 7%, which is the market rate right now for underperforming loans. And our goal is, by bringing in technology, by digitizing farmers and being able to use very specific data sets to understand where the farmers are, we can mitigate the risk and work below the baseline. I'm very excited about the work that Rita and I have done over the last 5 years in putting agriculture at the center of technology, not just thinking about fintech and payments, but thinking about what are the sectors that are really driving where these payments are coming from. Rita and I, as I mentioned, we chose this work because we recognized very early in college the disconnect that there was in our upbringing, how our education system was, and what was actually happening on the ground. And for me, when I think about leadership, and this is my segue of moving on from just thinking about FarmDrive to leadership and what some of my other colleagues in the continent are doing. When I think about leadership, for me, it's how do we connect what we are learning in the classroom? How do we connect what we are learning from the institutionalized education systems to the real world? For me, that's where the real education happens. So that's where we get the real fruits of education. As I mentioned, Rita and I met in a computer science class. We got exposed a lot to problem solving. And I have to mention that my undergrad was at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. That's where I took my undergraduate classes, interacted with my professors from early on when I joined the first year program. Rita and I got an opportunity to work with faculty and do different projects. We worked, one of the projects that we worked on for 1 year was with the Nokia Research Center back then, when Nokia was still producing mobile phones and doing a lot of research in Africa. And we worked on a project the project was dubbed Learning by Doing, and the work that we were doing was trying to design games on mobile phones, the feature phones. If you remember the Nokia 3310s, I'm sure some of the people from the continent remember that very well. We were designing mobile phone games for kids in rural areas to learn from. I think for us, that's really where our journey or the seed was planted for how much we can do with our computer science skills. And especially connect that to the rural areas or connect that to low resource, low income areas. We did that project for 1 year and we were able to deploy, and this was in our first year, we were able to deploy games to the Nokia Ovisto, games that were actually being used in schools. That was a mind-blowing, or that was a very eye-opening experience for us. And it led to us starting to think broadly about our role. Where do we apply our skills in the real world? I remember by the time we were graduating college, we were getting a lot of good offers from many global organizations, from Google's, from the Facebooks. And this is as young women who grew up in rural areas, having gone through computer science and living in Kenya, getting all these offers to move to London, to move to the US from Kenya. And it was at that moment that we realized not only the power that we have, but the value of the privilege of education that we had. And we made a decision to apply those skills, to turn down those offers and apply those skills in solving problems that we understood. We've been supported by the ecosystem in Kenya and in Africa, and that's what gave us the confidence to actually put aside our ambitions to pursue corporate careers and focus on building FarmDrive and focus on addressing this problem. We knew we had an ecosystem of the different hubs that were coming up in Africa. That was about 10 years ago. There was a lot of activity happening in the continent when it comes to technology, and that space gave us the leap, or it gave us the nudge that we needed to take the risk to get into agriculture, from our early angel investors who put in the money to some of our partners like Safaricom, and one of our mentors, the late Bob Colimo, who really believed in the work that we did and saw an opportunity to blend the work that Safaricom is doing as a big telecommunication company to agriculture, because most of the users, and as I mentioned, when you think about agriculture and the continent, 54% of the working population, 54% of the consumers, I would go on to say, work in a way in the value chain. So it's a sector, it's something that we can't dissociate from our day-to-day lives, and especially when we move on to talk about the food systems and the fact that everyone has to feed. What I've learned in those 5-6 years about leadership and in introspection, when I look at the risk that Rita and myself took, is as a leader, you have to have a purpose, and you have to have a passion or something that you're working on that goes beyond yourself. We chose to work in the agriculture sector because we believed that beyond our mothers and the privilege they had to have double incomes, there were people who didn't have that privilege, and there's more that we could do to solve that problem for millions of other people. So, and I think for me, that's the seed that has to be planted for the kind of future leaders that we're thinking about for Africa. How do you go beyond yourself? How do you connect what you're learning and move on beyond yourself and your games to thinking about the critical problems that needs to be addressed in the continent? And we can't dissociate thinking about the problems that are to be solved in the continent with technology. There are very many areas to apply technology to solve or to leapfrog. That's the common buzzword that's applied to Africa, to leapfrog and create change in some of these social issues. And we are talking about the healthcare sector, we are talking about the education sector, the financial sector. As leaders, we have to start thinking, we have to continue thinking, as future leaders, we have to continue thinking about what's our role in applying technology to solve some of these problems. And one of the key things that has been very fruitful for us, especially with this work in agriculture, is going down to the rural areas and the villages and really empathizing and spending time to understand what exactly is going on here and what are the challenges that farmers are facing. When we started FarmDrive, we thought, if we just put things together and build cool products and on mobile phones and SMSs being sent here and there, we'll get money down to the farmers. But it's the spending time with the farmers on the ground that we got to understand that just putting money on the hands or in mobile money wallets of farmers does not fix risk issues. It does not fix weather problems. It does not fix market problems. That's why we have to seek partnerships with other people who have the resources to help us address some of these challenges. Agriculture in itself, financing agriculture in itself does not fix problems. You have to work in partnerships, which brings me to my other point around future leaders. We have to think more collaboration than competition. I look at the tech ecosystem in Africa, and my reference point in this case is Nairobi. When you look at 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when the ecosystem was starting, everyone was very excited, but at the same time, there was a lot of competitive energy. There was a lot of competition happening and being compared to each other, and people were not able to share information freely and be open about the challenges that they are going through. But there's been a great shift happening, and in the last 3 years itself, there have been very many unicorns coming out of Africa, billions of funding going on into the continent. A lot of this has happened because of collaborative efforts. Technology companies, young startups are now collaborating. More entrepreneurs that got lucky and made money early on have reinvested, have become angel investors and invested that money back into the ecosystem as not only angel investors, but also LPs in some of the funds that are coming up. They are mentors and they are really working hard to provide some of the lessons they've learned and building a better ecosystem. One other area that I've seen is really making an impact and contributing to the kind of leadership that we need is there's a lot of accountability happening in the continent, especially among the young people around the organizations that we are building, institutional governance. How do we build the right workplace and the right work environments that are not only inclusive, but also think broadly about the environmental and the social impact of where people work? That's a very big factor that I have seen. And when I think about the future leadership of Africa, the governance and strong structures in the institutions is very key. Moving on to some of the leaders that have inspired me, or some of the future leaders that are doing work. It was in April 2019, the year just before COVID. I was attending a dinner at this Skull World Forum in Oxford. Skull World Forum is one of the biggest gatherings of social entrepreneurs who are thinking about some of these social issues globally. And during one of the serendipitous dinners, I sat next to this man who had just moved from the US to Rwanda, I think at that time, Rwanda or South Africa, I'm not able to recall exactly. And this man used to be a vice president at Goldman Sachs, but he moved to Rwanda because he went to work at the Africa Leadership Group. And I was asking him, you are a VP at Goldman Sachs, that's a dream job. And you moved to work for African leadership. Why? Tell me more. Why this big shift? You're moving your family, everything. What happened? And he told me that he read about the work that Fred Swanika is doing with the African Leadership Group through African Leadership Academy and the African Leadership Universities. His vision for building young leaders who are intentional and building the next generation of leaders. He read about that work and he knew he has to be part of it. And that he handed in his resignation, packed his things, packed his family, and moved to Rwanda to be part of this mission. I think for me, and I tell this story in very many places. I think I told this story to admissions at MIT as well in part of my application. The reason why this story stood out for me is building the right kind of leadership requires building institutions or building a vision that's beyond yourself, that's able to inspire people from different parts of the globe to want to work with you. When I think about people who are driving transformation of building leadership in the continent, Fred Swanika comes to mind. Through the work that he's doing with the African Leadership Group, building the different universities, and as he calls them, it's the Ivy Leagues of Africa. He's not only developing the next generation of young leaders and providing them the education and providing them the perspective and the right framework or framing that they need to think about the continent, but he's also bringing in the best talent and different leaders from different parts of the world that have done work in different sectors and leaders in the different sectors to the continent to exchange this knowledge. And that drives me to one of the reasons why I chose to apply to MIT and come to the US to get my education for 2 years. I thought about being that kind of inspirational leader that's able to attract people that are interested in agriculture, that are interested in changing the food systems in the world, to come and work with me, to move from Japan, to move from Hong Kong, to move from the US, to move from Rwanda, to come and join me in Nairobi to drive this mission. That's why I needed to be in this structured environment, to network in a different environment, and to talk about this vision and mission that I have for Africa and my big bet on agriculture transforming the economy in Africa. And when I go back to my point that I mentioned earlier, real education happens when we put what we learn, when we connect what we learn into the real world. And for me, I'm very excited about the possibility of quality leaders in the future, the possibility of merging technology, merging education, and merging the kind of education that young leaders are getting to build prosperity for all in the continent. And I think we are on the right track to achieve that. Moving over to you, Claude. I know there are questions coming in from the chat. I want to move on to the questions.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Peris. It's always so inspiring to hear you speak about your vision for the future and the actual steps that you've taken to make it happen versus a lot of other young Africans who reach out to me, who always talk about, I'm going to do this and that, but they never do it. And so you're a doer. But I wanted to clarify something before moving on to the questions. You said that less than 3% of commercial funding in Africa goes to farmers. And one statistic many of us are aware of is, farmers are actually 70% of the jobs in Africa, 70% of the population in Africa. And then I'm just thinking in a country like Kenya, which is kind of very well known for cash cropping, right? This profit-driven method of farming, where a lot of big corporations like Unilever and so on have been making so much money, getting such high profits at the expense of the kinds of smallholder farmers that you described, these tea farmers, for instance. When you look at the fact that these huge corporations are making huge profits, and the smallholder farmers are often really, and I've seen it myself, living in poverty, and there's just no way out of this poverty. How, as a young leader in Kenya, and as somebody who's recognized in the tech sector in Kenya, how do you think you can actually mobilize other young leaders to put pressure on these big corporations so that they can push for what I'll just call fair trade?
And I mean, I have to plug in that we are having the MIT Africa conference on Saturday from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. And we have a very stellar agriculture panel of 5 panelists from different parts of the continent that are coming to address some of these questions. So I'd encourage some of you who are interested to come in and extend this conversation. For me, when I think about agriculture and the big players and the questions and the push to, we need to push. Why are we talking about smallholder agriculture? We need to talk about large scale. We need to talk about commercial farming. Commercial farming does not mean Unilever. Commercial farming does not mean the big players. Commercial farming means the ability to make money. And that's why for FarmDrive, our key message is driving money to where it's needed most, driving money to smallholder farmers. Because the problem we have with subsistence farming, or the problem that we have with smallholder farmers in agriculture, is not a size problem, it's a yield problem. How do we increase the yield per acreage? When we start thinking about solving some of those problems, solving mechanization, providing the right capital, providing the right information to the farmers, and not just, a lot of governments think intervention for high yields is fertilizer subsidies, but really thinking broadly about the agronomic expertise that's required to increase yield per acreage, then we start. Unilever is not the center of food systems in Africa. I want to take a step back and respond to your question that instead of focusing on how Unilever is bad and fair trade, let's move to thinking about commercialization of small farms, consolidation, mechanization, and increasing yield on those small farms will help diversify beyond Unilever and the big players that we have. And this is a conversation that we're going to have with the experts who are coming into the Africa conference on Saturday.
Great. Well, I realize we only have 3 minutes left, but I did want to get a couple of questions in really quickly, and I would appreciate short answers before we get to the final question on books. And the first one, and it has to do with what you said about leaders collaborating and cooperating in order to achieve better results together. And there's an anonymous attendee who's asking, how do you perceive trust building within the framework of building ecosystems and encouraging tangible collaboration?
I'll use FarmDrive as an example for how we've been able to build trust and what I've seen work in the ecosystem. I think trust is built when, number one, when people are vulnerable, when people recognize that they don't know everything. We started working with Safaricom, which is one of the largest entities in the continent when we were still very scrappy and below $50,000 revenue. The reason why this partnership happened, it's because the CEO of Safaricom recognized the vision in the CEO of FarmDrive. That's myself. From this multi-million-dollar company to a less than $50,000 revenue company, we all had a shared vision. And for me, that's recognizing that vulnerability, that we are all working towards the same thing, will help us build trust, and also building strong institutions. All along, as we've built FarmDrive with Rita, we've been very consistent with our message that we're working with smallholder farmers, and we want to change how we view smallholder farmers. We want to change how financing works for smallholder farmers. We're not trying to be a bank, we want to partner. So being very consistent in what you're trying to address, long-term mission, and being vulnerable is one of the ways we start building trust ecosystems.
Thank you, Peris. I really appreciate the way that you explain your own perception of future leadership. And I think a lot of it, and I'll just say it from my perspective, is totally diametrically opposed to the way many African countries have been led for the past decades, and I would even say centuries. The final thing I will say in response to one of the questions is, you can continue a lot of these dialogues at the MIT Africa Innovate conference on Saturday. I put the link in the chat so that everybody could sign up. I've been involved with every single one of those conferences for the past 11 years. So I'm very proud of the fact that there's many young leaders from the Africa ecosystem at MIT and elsewhere who participate in this conference. So this is just a plug for the conference this coming Saturday. And the final thing I can ask Peris in the 1 minute that we have left is if she can recommend 3 books, please, Peris, 3 books that inspire you or that you love that we can share with this audience here.
3 books that I feel have been very transformational, and by transformation I mean I think about them on a day-to-day basis. One of the books is When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Zelinsky. It's a very, I would say, more philosophical and also practical book, thinking more about long time and your impact in the world. There's Prosperity Paradox by Efosa Ojomo, who's one of our keynote speakers for the conference. The reason why that book stands out for me is how do you create innovation in low resource areas, which in the context of Africa applies everywhere. If you need answers to that and how to get things started, then you need to read that book. And one of my other favorites is Becoming by Michelle Obama. Michelle is one of the greatest leaders in the world right now. And in Becoming, she illustrates her story from how she grew up and how she was able to take on her role at the State House in a very graceful way, and some of the work she did behind the scenes to advocate for women, to advocate for girls, and food and nutrition as well. So those are my key top books that I would recommend, apart from recommending data modeling and decision books, because now I go to MIT and data is what I breathe.
We all have that book. I have it right here, Data Models and Decisions by Freud. So thank you so much, Peris, for again, sharing a lot of these kind of lived experiences with us. I think many of the participants today will agree with me that you are one of the kinds of leaders that Africa needs for the future. And I will wrap up by speaking about next week's webinar, which is again at 12 p.m. on Thursday. I want to thank the MIT Center for International Studies and the MIT Africa program through Africa University. On Thursday of next week, I will be speaking with Marie-Cécile Zinsou, who is the founder of the Zinsou Foundation in Benin in Cotonou. And we'll be talking about, wow, is it possible that Africa is actually becoming a cultural force? I think the answer for me would be yes, but you will discover more when you tune in next week. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your day or your evening or afternoon. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you.